your buyer right now has the pick of the litter. The colors, instead of a gray or a whitewash, it's red, and you don't like red. And all of a sudden, you're just not picking that house.
Yeah. Investors buy for one reason, they sell for hundreds of reasons.
Yeah, that's why you would invest.
Right?
Recently, I've been dealing with a lot of both buyer and sellers for the investment property space, particularly your small multifamily duplexes and triplexes. In today's video, we are going to discuss selling those properties, both tenant occupied and vacant, as well as the opportunities that may present themselves for buyers looking to get into that marketplace. Stay tuned for this one. So recently, I've had you've on the mortgage side, me on the real estate side, we've had a few people talking about selling, a few investors talking about selling properties, particularly tenant-occupied properties.
Yeah.
And I think there's a few things that are very interesting to consider when you are considering selling a tenant-occupied property, both in terms of just selling an investment property in general, and then as well as whether it makes sense to sell a tenant-occupied, try and do something like the cash for keys, and if you are selling a tenant-occupied, what some of the things that you want to be aware for, particularly how they'll kind of affect price.
Yeah.
I guess to start, like kind of talking about just selling investment properties in general. Say you refinance the property in 2021, 2022, maybe you have some equity in it because you bought it in before COVID kind of thing, but you refinance at a higher rate.
Yep.
What are your kind of thoughts on selling that property now? Maybe you can break even on the sale in terms of after your new rate. Do you think that makes sense? Or is it like, obviously a lot of people are kind of underwater right now, right? So
I sold one of my rental properties that I purchased at the end of 2021.
Okay.
That I had to write a check to my lawyer for $10,000 in order to sell it.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what you said. In that particular case, there was no refinance per se. It was more just a matter
but say you bought a property recently, you're kind of underwater, you want to get rid of it.
But that property was losing $800 a month when it was fully rented, right? So the $10,000 I lost was what I was going to lose in the next 12 months anyways, right? But I think for investors, it's curious, especially if they've purchased it a few years ago, they made a good amount of equity, but then when they've refinanced at a higher value, they've taken their profit to maybe go buy another property. So when they sell, right now their loan to value is maybe 80%, but that 20% of equity isn't their equity because they still need to pay the capital gains on the money that they refinanced out.
Yeah.
Right? So like you said, there are cases where they're selling it at a profit, but there's no cash flow. There's no cash hitting their bank account from the sale.
Yeah. It's almost just reducing a liability.
Yeah, pretty much the only scenario that this makes sense is if they're just worried they have too much debt, right? If too much debt on multiple properties, they want to just shrink what they own. And I did that a little bit. And I've talked to a few clients in that situation, but it's a hard decision to make, right? Because I think a quote that I found very useful is, investors buy for one reason, they sell for hundreds of reasons.
Yeah.
Right? When you're buying, you think you're going to make money.
That's why you would invest.
Right? And when you're selling, downsizing, trimming your portfolio, reducing your risk, paying off debts, found something else better you want to put the money into, right? There's so many reasons. So, it's a hard one, right? And especially it's not ideal when you've had a property and you're for many years and you're selling it and you don't really walk away with much. That's a tough pill to swallow.
Yeah.
I think.
So I guess before we get into selling kind of those investment properties, what are, I guess, the scenarios where you think it would make sense for somebody to, obviously, like if you're losing a lot of money every month and you want to kind of just cut your losses, that's obviously one scenario.
Yeah. And you don't have the means to kind of weather it out, right? I think the other scenario that I've thought about for myself, and I've kind of had conversations with clients about this, is, if you have 5 or 10 properties and your portfolio as a whole is no longer cash flowing, maybe some are, some aren't, but as a whole it's not, does it make sense to sell some so that you can hang on to the rest for the long term.
Right.
Right? Because maybe it's easier to get through the long term with fewer than with everything you have. I don't know, what scenarios have you seen where, well, what are the, I guess, tougher situations where someone has been forced to sell? Because I know you've dealt with that a little bit recently. And what are some of the maybe more opportunistic decisions you've seen people make recently?
For sure. So, I mean, I've seen some on the more opportunistic side. Lots of people we know bought in partners.
Sure.
Right. So say you have one person who kind of, for whatever reason, wants the money.
Yep.
And so you've got a property you bought a while ago, you got lots of equity in it. And, maybe you see some good opportunities in another form of real estate. Maybe you have a single family home and single family is doing pretty good. You could get it vacant. You'd like to sell it and go buy a multi because multis are really depressed right now. Sure. So you can kind of make that equity play and shift it over. I think that could be a really good option there. Or, just sometimes you want to sell your rental property because you're with a partner. And so you got to sell that one. And then because of that, you've incurred a large capital gain.
Yeah.
And then maybe you have another property that's underwater every month and you can kind of sell that property to offset that capital gain. I have talked with a few people through those scenarios. Again, forced or pushed to sell a property in a partnership that does produce a large capital gain. That also probably offset maybe that property was a cash flow earner for you. And now you had to sell that one, and now your portfolio then turns into negative. So you look at a property that's maybe you bought recently, it's losing $300, $400, $500 a month, but you could also sell it and kind of offset that capital gain a little bit out. So that's, I think, another interesting scenario.
Yeah. Kind of pair it, right? Like sell a winner, sell a loser.
Sell a winner, sell a loser, and then how does that net out for you?
Yeah.
Kind of thing, right? Okay. Particularly if there's partnerships involved and you kind of get to dissolve one there. Those are the nicer sides, or the nicer reasons why you have to do it. Obviously, you've got the other side too, where people just need to sell.
Yeah.
And we've seen a little bit of that recently, and those ones are often trickier as well, because when you need to sell, sometimes you actually can't sell a property, right? Where you may have seen a scenario, or hypothetically speaking, your property's worth what the mortgage is.
Yeah.
And then after you pay me, you pay the buyer's agent, you pay your lawyer, you actually have to pay, like you did, to close the property.
Yeah.
Right? And you probably are selling that property because you don't have the money. So it's a very...
To come up with money to sell something that you can't afford to keep is,
that's a bad scenario.
Yeah.
Right? So hopefully in that case, you've got maybe a vacant property or something that's actually going to do well on the market, because when selling an investment property, there's a few things, particularly in this market, that did not affect it as much as it used to, right? So number one is tenants being in the property regardless of their rent. So obviously, didn't matter the course of time. You had tenants paying under market rent. It was always more difficult to sell a property, right? Now, even if tenants are paying market rent, or close to market rent, maybe just a couple $100 below a month, pretty reasonable. Way more difficult to sell a property just with tenants being in there. Obviously, if your tenants are good tenants, they show the property well, they're nice to agents who go through, that does help your cause a lot.
But even then, right? Like my brother, you recently helped them to kind of purchase a place here in St. Catharines. When they were selling their home, they are owner occupiers. They needed to declutter their home, pack all their stuff, and they did a ton of packing, throwing away, in order to bring it to a for sale ready condition. The tenant's not going to do that. So even if they keep the place in a neat shape, when someone lives in a home, it's not the same as a home that's staged, even just cleaned and painted and ready for sale, right? And
let's use a single family home there, for example, because I think it's easier to kind of compare apples to apples, right? If you have a single family home that is, say, a nice, 2-story, 1,500 square feet, reasonable starter home.
Sure.
Okay. And your tenant moves out, you can give it a coat of paint, stage it, and sell it. Everything's the same, the finishes, lot size, everything. Now you got your neighbor across the street, down the street. Tenants in there's fine. They keep good care of the place. There's no issues with the tenant. You are going to see a very different price between those two homes, even if everything else by value is the same. Roof's the same age, everything like that's all the same. You're going to see it because guess what? Your buyer right now has the pick of the litter.
Yeah.
And so when you walk into those two homes and one smells like cookies and you just walk in, you just kind of almost get this feeling, oh, this is nice. I could see myself living here, as opposed to maybe the other one's bad, but maybe it just doesn't, it's not your smell. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? It smells like somebody else's house and it doesn't fit with your nose, and the colors, instead of a gray or a whitewash, it's red and you don't like red. And all of a sudden you're just not picking that house because you have another option that matches exactly what you want.
Well, you mentioned that recently you worked with a lot more first-time home buyers.
Yeah.
When you're working with a buyer, what have you found in terms of their willingness to even go see tenant-occupied homes?
Willingness to see them, I think, is very high.
Okay.
Willingness to see them, generally speaking, at least with the people I've worked with.
Okay. Because they see a lower price, or they
see a lower price, and I try and tell my first-time home buyers, in particularly, let's go look at these homes because
there's some opportunity there.
There's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you're a first-time home buyer, if you're a first-time home buyer and you can deal with a little bit of a scent or painting once you move in, you are going to get a way better deal than if you need that place to be staged, look great, smell great, all these little things that once the tenant moves out, you can take care of in a weekend before you move in.
Yeah.
If you're willing to do that, you will get a way better deal than if you're not.
I think it's tough though. Like I recently purchased a car and I did a test drive of a car by a dealership.
Yep.
They just recently got it. They didn't clean it.
Didn't detail it,
right? So it's like, there's like dirt, there's little garbage here and there, right? And I don't know, it was a car I liked, but I think as a emotional buyer looking to get something I like, I was just turned off by that.
Yeah.
Versus when I went to see another vehicle that was clean, prepared, and then I could just focus on the car. Yeah. I didn't have to think about there's dirt or something, right? So I think for those who have the ability to look past it, they can really take advantage of it.
Absolutely, they can.
But probably a lot of
people don't.
People don't, and a lot of realtors don't want to deal with that. They don't want to deal with I'm buying a tenant-occupied home. What if the tenants don't move out? Then my buyer's homeless. They've given notice to where they're renting, and they're somehow stuck in the middle, trying to help the buyers
bridge this or whatever.
Right. So it is extra work and extra stress. So,
but you get paid fairly well to do it. I would say
buyer does.
On the buyer does, I would say not the realtor, but on a $500,000 home, you're probably making $25,000.
Yeah.
500 to 475 for that exact scenario that we talked about. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
So from the selling side, something to consider, and then from the buying side, something to consider. And I've even had conversations with first-time home buyers where you get on the first-time call with them, you explain, hey, are you guys open to this scenario? And on the phone call, they're like, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to save money, blah, 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 blah. Yeah. They walk into the house with their mom or their dad, and they're just absolutely not, you're not living here. And then everything changes. You can kind of have that intention, but you said, when you went into that used car and there was just, crumbs on the seat over here and smelled like the person's cat because they always text with them or whatever, it was oh, this is a little bit different. I don't know if I want to deal with this.
Yeah.
Right? So when selling a property, something to very much consider. You're well, the neighbor sold for this and ours is better. We have an updated kitchen. They don't. But theirs was clean and vacant and, painted or whatever, right?
Well, I think in my brother's case, when they sold the home, I told them, move into our parents.
Yeah.
Just get the hell out of there so that it's as empty. You should never be there when the buyer is coming to see the place.
Exactly.
Just give them space, let them see the place, right? And it's hard to do that with a tenant-occupied home.
It's hard to do that in your own home.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hard to do that in your own home. I have some dream sellers that are you're I don't know how you live here like this, but this is amazing. This is going to make my job so much easier, right? And then you have other people that are just normal people.
So,
they both work.
Honestly, I'm curious to know, what do you tell your sellers, for an owner-occupied home, they're living in it, they're trying to sell it. What do you tell them to do during showings? Do you ask them if they have family or friends they can stay at, or what's the norm?
Yeah, I think it really depends. My fiance has this thing that when we have company coming over, it's the operation we don't sit.
Okay.
And it means we don't sit in the house, okay? Everything's fluffed up. You can stand in the kitchen, but we don't sit, okay? This operation, we don't sit.
Oh, man.
And so, sometimes when you meet a seller, you can get a vibe that these people get it because they probably cleaned up for you when you went there, and you're like, okay, we can do operation, we don't sit with them. But there's the vast majority of people where that isn't going to work, right? And then you kind of have to have hey, what can we do, right? And oftentimes, myself personally, I bring in a stager. Okay. And I do a staging consultation. Yeah. And the one thing I like about the stager is she's brutally honest. You need this gone, you need this gone, you need this gone. And you start and I'm just kind of sitting there watching my sellers and just watching. They're like, yep. Or they're like, and they get the fear of God look in their face. Like, this isn't going to work, right? And so from there, you kind of have to play in each scenario. Obviously, like in the best case scenario, you either, you don't sit, or you tidy up and you can go maybe stay at your cottage or stay at a mom, dad's or kid's house or whatever it happens to be. But you got to do everything you can. I mean, oftentimes even just like a storage unit for the 2-3 months while you're there. Yeah. What do we need to live? How can we make this as easy as possible for you to clean up? That's a good one for them because it does make a big difference, especially now. When a buyer has options, you need to do something to stand out.
Well, I guess the thing about now is, like you were telling me before, like homes aren't getting a crazy number of showings either. So it's a little bit easier to like make them count, right? Leave the place, clean it up. If you're getting like 40 showings in a week, like
it's a little
how prepared are you going to be?
It's a little bit different. It's very different, right?
But I guess in that scenario, homes were selling faster.
Yeah, then you just move out for a week.
Right? Yeah.
Like at that point in time, like that's a different scenario, right? Yeah. And that obviously kind of comes into your pricing strategy and how you're going to do it on that. But that's a big factor. I would say the next kind of thing to consider, like we started off here, is selling a true tenant-occupied home. Yeah. So you've got a home, you're not giving them cash for keys, it's multiple units, whatever it is, you're going to have to sell a tenant-occupied home. And then there's a huge spread there. Yes. Huge spread there. Yeah. How the tenants present themselves is huge. Yep. Whether you can actually get in to see the property is another huge one.
Do they need written paper notices or are they okay with the text?
And forget about that. They've got a big dog that doesn't go in a cage. Yeah. What are you going to do?
That's tough.
You're not going to just tell the agent to go in there if there's a pit bull sitting in there. Right? You've got to wait for the tenant to be home. You've got to kind of strategize that. Yeah. And all these things play a role in your factor huge. Because say you've got a great duplex. It's bringing in $3,500 a month. It's in a good neighborhood, but you can only show the property 3 times a week for 2 hours.
Yeah, it's tough.
Good luck. Yeah. That's going to affect your price a lot. Yeah. A lot. Because people want to be able to see it. They want to see that it's presented well. Obviously, us on the real estate side, we can we can work with those scenarios, but you have to understand there's going to be a price reduction or a concession somewhere in order to do that, because when a buyer has options, they're going to choose another property, all else being equal.
Yeah. No, it's a tough scenario, right? And to be fair, even for the tenants, it's not a comfortable time, right?
No, they didn't choose to sell a property.
They didn't choose. There's some uncertainty. If a home buyer buys in, then they'll have to move. They'll have to find a new place. So they're not excited for you selling this house. They're not trying to help you sell most of the time, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I think the way you approach it with tenants, and each tenant's obviously unique. I mean, I think generally speaking, the better a tenant presents themselves, the more likely the new buyer wants to keep them.
Oh, a new buyer as an investor.
As an investor, right? Okay. I saw a place yesterday. We went downstairs. It was main floor vacant, lower unit tenant occupied. Yeah. Went downstairs, tenants, hey, come on right in. Place was these people were debating. They could move into the lower level. They had a lot of different options. They could have easily got rid of the tenants. Walk downstairs, the place is clean. Tenants are polite and friendly. Yeah. Every look around, we go to leave. They're like, what are these guys paying? They're like, if it's anywhere close to market, let's keep them. They're great. Yeah. Right. So if you're a tenant and you want to stay in your place and you want to do that, try and make it easy, because it increases your odds so much that you're going to get somebody who wants to keep you. True. Right. And it depends, again, if you're the tenant, you're not going to know what the seller situation is. Yeah. The seller doesn't have to sell the property, and you want to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. then maybe you can, and maybe it deters your seller from selling.
Yeah.
But if the seller has to sell the property, we're going to sell it.
Yeah.
And you might cost your seller $50,000 or your landlord $50,000, but you also probably lost yourself a place to live.
A place, right?
And so, does that make sense? Does that not make sense, right? And these are the conversations when we go to tenant-occupied places.
Yeah.
We want to empathize with the tenant, let them know, I know you didn't pick this.
Yeah.
I know this sucks. I know you have no control. I'm going to try and give you some control by telling you the things that you can do to get the scenario that is going to fit you best, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? But it is tricky right now. And it's way, way, way trickier than it, I think, has been the last 5 years, particularly for tenant-occupied properties. So that's another thing, whereas if you do have to sell something, so you are that investor that your portfolio is losing a little bit a month and you got 3 properties that maybe you could sell, then it's like, okay, which one makes the most sense? Well, what are my non-property factors that are going to affect the sale? And then you kind of want to counter that into what you're doing as well, because if you have to sell a property from a non-property factor that's going to decrease your sale price, that non-property factor might not be there forever. And so now you're taking a hit. Even though you need to sell one of the 3, you're taking a disproportionate hit by selling one that's maybe much more difficult to sell, right? So,
yeah, and I think we've covered this already, but there's a difference now between selling a tenant-occupied investment property like a triplex, fourplex, and a tenant-occupied single-family home, maybe a duplex.
Even a duplex, yeah.
But something where it's reasonable for a home buyer to purchase it, move in, right? And it becomes like that entry-level first home, right? So that is interesting to see. But even with all of that, even if it is a single-family home, it would still sell for better if it was vacant, painted, a little bit of staging, just prepared, versus looking like an investment property and all the things we kind of discussed, right? So
that's a good topic, and I think one thing we should just, before kind of wrapping up the investment property sale, but kind of talking about the difference for, like, again, say you're a first-time home buyer, okay, and say you can qualify for $500,000. Okay, if you have a tenant paying $1,500 to $1,700 in one unit, how much approximately? I'm kind of throwing you on the spot here, but how much approximately extra am I getting in purchasing power? If I get an extra $1,600, $1,700 a month.
What is that a month? Sorry, what is that a year? So roughly 20 odd grand a year of income gets you ballpark, I think 70 to 100 grand in purchasing power. Okay,
so you go from, like, say, 500 to 575.
Yeah.
Call it, right? So, I mean, that's an interesting scenario for a lot of first-time home buyers as well.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Do you buy a $500,000 property that is going to be all your own, whatever?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think on this scenario, your mortgage is going to be fairly similar. Or would your mortgage price actually be less when you consider the rental income?
Payments?
Yes.
Your mortgage payment would be much less if you're making that 20 grand of income, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be a higher mortgage payment.
Yes, but you've been including that.
You have the income, right? And the funny thing in that scenario is you could even, like, if you wanted to buy that home and didn't even want the tenant, right? If you just had it as a self-contained unit, some lenders will just put a market rent for that. If it's a self-contained unit, it doesn't even have to be legal, allow you to qualify, and then assuming you had the ability to cover your payments, you just don't rent it out and you use it for yourself.
Yeah, maybe you just unlock that two-way door or whatever, right?
I think the self-contained, it depends how strict the lender is. They may want to see it fully closed off.
Drywalled off or whatever.
Depending on how far they go, because they either go based on the MLS or the appraisal. Right. So that's how they're going to find out if it's self-contained or not. But yeah, if it is, then that additional income can help you to qualify. So
yeah, that's a very interesting thing. Again, for if you are a first-time home buyer, somebody maybe looking to get into the market right now, you also may be able to get a property that's, I don't want to say this, but like it's disproportionately discounted for having a tenant in it or something like that, right? So say you've got $500,000 of property versus a $575,000 property. If that property, like we were just saying earlier, duplexes on the same street as single-family homes, all else being equal, the duplex used to be way higher. Now it's not that case at all.
So now it's the same, but easier to qualify.
Yes.
So it's a curious like sweet spot for the enterprising individual.
Yeah, obviously there's things there that you have to consider. But I mean, again, if you're coming from, say, living in a duplex, you were living on the main floor.
You're used to it already.
You were paying $2,100 a month in rent.
Yeah.
Now you go buy that same duplex, live on the main floor, don't change your lifestyle, and financially, all of a sudden you're in a way better spot than you would have otherwise. And potentially, you have the opportunity to probably negotiate on that home a lot more than you would have if you're buying that same home single family with a bathroom and a family room in the basement or something like that, right? Yeah. So it's an interesting I mean,
it sounds like a great time for first-time buyers and a not so great time for the investor sellers, right? But that's kind of the reality.
I would say if that's the summary of today, I couldn't agree more. Right? But obviously that everybody's in a unique scenario, and our jobs obviously are to, if you are a seller and you have to sell, we still have to find a way to get you the best money for your property and kind of do it that way. And some of those topics that we talked about in terms of how you can try and prepare your property for sale will help a lot. But yeah, I mean, if you can hang on, or depending on what makes sense, could be interesting. So
yeah, I think same as, I don't know if rates are going to be that much, or if prices are going to be that much higher in 3 years. Hopefully rates are lower, but definitely the market is going to hopefully be more rational at that point, where investment properties are priced based on its merits and not just
highest and best use, right?
Exactly.
Highest and best use for those two properties that we talked about should be the duplex.
Yeah.
It's housing two families, if none of the less.
Someone spends $100,000 on a legal basement, get permits, does fire separation, egress windows, all of that. That is worth something. It costs something, right? And
when there's a housing shortage, you would think more units would be more attractive.
And when things are unaffordable, the ability to create income from a property, like even if you live upstairs, right? That's got to be worth something. I think that's a bit of an irrational aspect of this market right now.
I completely agree. So, we'll see if how many people take advantage of it and whether how it does play out in those 3 years, right? Because I think it'll be interesting to see. I definitely don't have a crystal ball, but it'll be fun to watch.
Yeah. What is it? 2027? 2027. After all the fixed rate mortgages get renewed, everyone has to face the higher rates. We'll see what that world looks like, hopefully with lower rates and a more rational. Hopefully investors start coming back. I think that's the hopeful expectation from.
Yeah, I mean, I think if rates go down so that you can get an investment property for in the fours, things start to get a little bit. You go down 1% right now from what an investment property is. Yeah. I think that starts to change things a lot for the investor side of things.
Because especially if investors already have properties that are kind of break even now, they're going to see their portfolio kind of get back into the green. So that also may be like, okay, now I have some space to think about adding some more versus like just trying to get through this and survive, right? So I think a few things may come together so fingers crossed.
It'll be interesting to see, that's for sure.
All right.
Awesome.